In this presentation, I'm posing the question, is patriarchy a useful concept for socialist feminists? Can it have, if you like, explanatory power? The context of this question is a long-standing critique by socialist feminists of the concept of patriarchy, which is used by radical feminists. So, what do radical feminists argue? They argue that patriarchy is the basic division of all societies between men and women, with men as the oppressors, that patriarchy underpins all other forms of oppression. And because of their common oppression, women form a social group with common interests. The aim of radical feminists who hold patriarchy as central to their analysis is to fundamentally change gender relations, which some radical feminists may express in a demand to eliminate male power, to eliminate masculine values. This presentation is based on a chapter of our new book called Why Socialist Feminism, which is written by Women in Workers' Liberty. The specific chapter I refer to is titled, Is Patriarchy Useful? Aside from the details, the general approach by Friedrich Engels back in 1885 in his book The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State is crucial for socialist feminism today. We are concerned with the position of women and how the position of women is shaped by ever-changing material conditions of existence. Women's oppression dates back to pre-capitalist societies, and historical work to trace the origins and nature of this oppression remains important today. In capitalist societies, changed and changing material conditions have generated and are generating distinct forms of oppression for women. Capitalism oppresses women in new ways. Take, for example, the commodification of the body. Capitalism has also produced conditions for women to enter the workplace, such that women have the opportunity to become economically independent and, crucially, to discuss their social position with other women and to organise to change it. In our earlier Workers' Liberty pamphlet, The Case for Socialist Feminism, Heidi Hartman's dual systems theory was critiqued, this notion that society is a dual system of capitalism and patriarchy. Referencing Iris Marion Young, who also troubles over a crude separation of struggles against patriarchy and capitalism, we make the following comment. Even the most feminist issues, like fighting for abortion rights and against sexual harassment at work, are inseparable from the general struggle for democracy and socialism. With the work of Sheila Rowbotham, we summate our problem with patriarchy, defined as a fixed structure, as returning us, indeed reducing us, to biology. For us as socialist feminists, we argue the crux is the social inequalities of gender. However, in the case for socialist feminism, we don't fully resolve our position on patriarchy, or rather, we don't consider whether any conceptualisation of patriarchy, our own conceptualisation of patriarchy in fact, might have analytical use, might offer explanatory power. Let's consider the wider debate on capitalism and patriarchy, which is actually a wider debate on the economic and the cultural. It's proposed by Iris Marion Young that we should conceptualise issues of justice involving cultural recognition and cultural identity as having inevitably material economic sources and consequences, without thereby being reducible to market dynamics or economic exploitation and deprivation. The feminist debate Young engages with aims to overcome the disjuncture, the gap between, on the one hand, the economic reductionism, the so-called economic reductionism of class politics that disregards the cultural, and on the other hand, identity politics which overlooks the economic. Young's conclusion is that the cultural is economic, the economic is cultural. The crux of this debate is the following question. How does one understand political struggles for cultural recognition? For example, historically by the Black Power movement, by gay activists today for gay marriage, and contemporary struggles by trans activists for equal human rights, for recognition in the law. How do we understand political struggles for cultural recognition and political struggles for economic redistribution? For Young, she rejects any kind of analytical distinction between the cultural and the economic. Counter to this, the so-called dual systems theorist, and I say so-called because I don't think her work is as crude as that label assumes, the so-called dual systems theorist Nancy Fraser sees struggles for cultural recognition as occurring in a world of exacerbated material inequality. For Nancy Fraser, cultural struggles are, of course, material. However, she also stresses that we need to figure out how to conceptualise, how to think through cultural recognition and social equality in forms that support rather than undermine one another. Again, by cultural recognition, we might think of the demand for transgender rights. On social equality, an example of this might be the demand for social housing, for better terms and conditions at work. So really, I think Nancy Fraser is asking, can we work out a politics that brings the two together rather than, and this is the important point, rather than, as we have seen over the years and the decades, rather than a tense standoff between class politics and identity politics. Nancy Fraser is interested in moving beyond the impasse between class struggle and identity politics. So Fraser makes a very helpful distinction, I think, between demands for redistribution and recognition, but the distinction is an analytical one only. So she says, by distinguishing analytically redistribution and recognition, and by exposing their distinctive logics, I aim to clarify and to begin to resolve some of the central political dilemmas of our age. Again, Fraser wishes to overcome this standoff between identity politics and class struggle. Bearing in mind Young's approach, the current intellectual fashion of intersectionality broadens the definitions of capitalism and class to the economic and the cultural. Indeed, within intersectionality, there's little to no analytical distinction between race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender and class and so on, since all are seen in these loose economic and cultural terms, all are seen as structures and ideologies of oppression. Yet class isn't another ideology of oppression. It's actually fundamentally a relation of exploitation, and homophobia, racism and sexism, for example, are different kinds of oppression. For example, capitalism can accommodate a form of gay equality by accommodating significant numbers of gay people who deviate from the heteronormative nuclear family. Gay families can be accommodated just as long as social reproduction is still being done for free for capital, right? The principal opponents to gay equality today in the West, in the global North, tend not to be corporate, but religious and cultural. On the other hand, capitalism could not tolerate the abolition of social reproduction by domestic female labour. Capitalism could not tolerate the abolition of class relations. Also importantly is Fraser's ability to spell out the historically specific nature of capitalism. So she says, and it's a dense quote which I hope to unpack. In pre-capitalist, pre-state societies, status simply is the overarching principle of distribution, and where status order and the class hierarchy are therefore fused. Misrecognition simply entails maldistribution. In capitalist societies, in contrast, where the institutionalisation of specialised economic relations permits the relative uncoupling of economic distribution from structures of prestige, and where status and class can therefore diverge, misrecognition and maldistribution are not fully mutually convertible. It is indeed a dense quote. So what does she actually mean here? Well, let's take my application of aspects of what I think she means vis-a-vis my own research on sexuality in 21st century urban China. Now, in my paper in Gender, Place and Culture, What's Radical About Reality TV, An Unexpected Tale from Shanghai of a Chinese Lesbian Anti-Hero, I chart the political economic change in China, which has generated openings for a personal life outside of the family and outside of the tight state control of sexuality. In simple terms, from the Maoist era to a period known as opening and reform, there are now new personal freedoms, albeit fragile and relative, for example, simple things like young people in the cities in China to go out to recreational space and date who they want to date. So I say in my paper, Fraser insists on focusing on the specific nature of capitalist social order as specialised economic relations that are relatively decoupled from the relations of kinship, family and political authority, the state, such that the connection between profit making on the one hand and sexual regulation on the other is weakened. Similar in one sense to the history of Western capitalism, capitalism in China has created conditions which have allowed for some women and men to organise a personal life around their erotic emotional attachment to their own sex, since the link between profit making and sexual regulation has weakened in force. Also importantly is Fraser's understanding of the different forms of oppression and the nature of the different forms of oppression and exploitation in, through and beyond capitalism, which is tied up with, linked to her appreciation of the historically specific nature of capitalism. So on class, she says, the task of the proletariat, the worker, is not simply to cut itself a better deal, although that is incredibly important. The task of the proletariat is not simply to cut itself a better deal, but to abolish itself as a class. The last thing it needs is a recognition of its difference. Class struggle isn't an identity politics in which the working class worldwide seeks to cement its identity and position of exploitation vis-a-vis the ruling class worldwide. Class struggle seeks to overthrow class relations and the exploitation and the inequality and the injustice that goes along with this. On sexuality, Fraser observes the following. She says, sexuality as a mode of social difference has roots that don't lie in the political economy of capitalism, because gay people are distributed throughout the entire class structure of capitalist society. They don't occupy a distinct position within the division of labour, and they don't constitute in and of themselves an exploited class. Rather, as a mode of collectivity, gay people, bisexual people, for example, as a despised sexuality, is the injustice that they suffer. Their mode of collectivity as a despised sexuality rooted in the cultural valuation structure of society. This injustice that they suffer is quintessentially a matter of misrecognition. So again, let's take the primary opponents of gay rights in the West today. They tend not to be first and foremost corporations, but religious and antiquated cultural institutions. On race, Fraser is sensitive to the history of racial science, which created the very false idea of race. And so she asks, surely the most effective kind of anti-racist politics is one that does not rely on a cultural politics of race, which relies on the idea of race. But rather we need an anti-racist politics that seeks to banish the idea of different racialised groups altogether. And so she says, how can anti-racist groups fight simultaneously to abolish race and to valorise racial group specificity? And on gender, she says this: we might disrupt the passage from our critique of economism to identity politics by integrating the struggle to transform a status order premised on masculinist cultural values with the struggle for economic justice. Here, quite simply, Fraser wishes to marry a struggle against patriarchy with class struggle. Some conclusions. In our earlier Workers' Liberty pamphlet, The Case for Socialist Feminism, we make the following still pertinent point. Women have been oppressed for thousands of years. Possibly they resisted the beginnings of oppression with violence. For sure, individual women have always kicked back and stood up for themselves, but the programme of women's liberation dates from capitalist societies. Capitalism continued the oppression of women, but changed it. Central to our programme for women's liberation is an understanding of the distinct conditions of existence created by capitalism. Now, I think there's explanatory worth to integrating into our analysis of the social inequalities of gender a concept of patriarchy. A concept of patriarchy defined as followed: as structures of male status and power over women, often pre-capitalist and cultural and religious in origin, which have come to fuse and collide with capitalist social relations and forces. So I'm thinking about various empirical realities, for example, the fierce anti-abortion movement in the United States, the prevalence of organised sexual abuse networks by British Pakistani men in this country, and the stark variation of violence against women around the world. You know, how do we explain these things? How do we explain these realities? To me, these empirical realities indicate an intersection, a fusion and a collision of capitalism and patriarchy. Okay, thanks for listening.